Chapter 13. Restoration of the Western Empire. It is evident that as the papacy had hitherto claimed, and had actually acquired, absolute dominion over all things spiritual, henceforth she would claim, and, if crafty policy and unscrupulous procedure were of any avail, would actually acquire absolute dominion over all things temporal as well as spiritual. Indeed, as we have seen, this was already claimed, and the history of Europe for more than 1,000 of the following years abundantly proves that the claim was finally and fully established. Rome, jealous of all temporal sovereignty but her own, for centuries yielded up, or rather made, Italy a battlefield to the Transalpine and the stranger, and at the same time so secularized her own spiritual supremacy as to confound altogether the priest and the politician, to degrade absolutely and almost irrevocably the kingdom of Christ into a kingdom of this world. Henceforth, kings and emperors were but her tools, and often but her playthings, and kingdoms and empires her conquests, and often only her traffic. The history of how the papacy assumed the supremacy over kings and emperors, and how she acquired the prerogative of dispensing kingdoms and empires, is no less interesting and no less important to know than is that of how her ecclesiastical supremacy was established. The contest began even with Justinian, who had done so much to exalt the dignity and clear the way of the papacy. Justinian soon became proud of his theological abilities and presumed to dictate the faith of the papacy rather than to submit as formerly to her guidance. And from A.D. 542 to the end of his long reign in 565, there was almost constant war, with alternate advantage, between Justinian and the popes. But as emperors live and die, while the papacy only lives, the real victory remained with her. Vigilius, November 22, 537 to 555, was pope when the Ostrogothic kingdom was destroyed in 538, and when, after the annihilation of the mixed people who were in rebellion, the dominion of the Eastern Empire was formally restored in Italy by the establishment of the Exarchate of Ravenna in 552. He paid a fearful price for his advancement: false accusation, cruel oppression, perhaps murder. He was the most vacillating of the popes who had yet reigned. The war between the papacy and Justinian was over what is known as the Three Chapters. In the writings of three men who lived and wrote nearly 100 years before, Justinian found what he proclaimed and condemned as heresy. The three men had all lived and written before the Council of Chalcedon. The three men and their writings had all been noticed by the Council of Chalcedon, yet their council had passed them, all without condemnation or even censure. And now, when Justinian condemned them all as heretical, this was held by all the orthodox as a covert attack on the Council of Chalcedon and an undermining of the authority of general councils as such. The emperor threatened with deposition and exile all bishops without distinction who would not accept his definitions as to the Three Chapters. Under such alternative, the new faith was soon adopted by almost all the bishops of the whole East. But in the West it met with no less vigorous than general opposition. Vigilius and the other bishops of Italy, as well as those of Gaul and Africa, all declared unanimously against it, as evidently striking at what they called the very foundation of the Catholic faith, the authority of councils. This position was so much the more essential to the Bishop of Rome because the Council of Chalcedon was especially the Council of Leo the Great, and the faith of Chalcedon was preeminently the faith of Leo as Pope. In 543, Justinian peremptorily summoned Vigilius to Constantinople. In 544, he set forth with the imprecations of the Roman people and assailed with volleys of stones, as the murderer of Silverius, and a man of notorious cruelty. May famine and pestilence pursue thee. Evil hast thou done to us. May evil overtake thee wherever thou art. Arrived at Constantinople, he was between two fires. If he resisted the emperor, he might be made a prisoner and an exile. If he yielded to the emperor, he would certainly be repudiated by all the West and might lose the papal throne. Having no strength of character or purpose, he sought alternately to please both the emperor and the West. Vigilius arrived at Constantinople January 25, 547. He was received with uncommon marks of respect by the emperor and the empress, but on the first occasion he condemned the emperor's condemnation of the 3 chapters, and excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople and all the bishops who had accepted the condemnation of the 3 chapters. Then, a few months after, the desire he had of returning to Rome prevailed over the regard he pretended to have for the Council of Chalcedon and the Catholic faith. He withdrew his excommunication and assembled in Constantinople a council of 70 bishops, at the head of which he issued his infallible anathema against the 3 chapters themselves. This caused all the West to revolt, in which joined even the ecclesiastics who had accompanied the Pope to Constantinople. He then revoked the declarations of his late council, and upon the plea that no Western bishops were present at the late council, prevailed on Justinian to count it as naught and call a general council. Great numbers of the Eastern bishops assembled for the council in 551, but only a very few from the West, some from Italy, only 2 from Africa, and not 1 from Illyricum, nor any from Gaul. The Pope refused to attend the council till a greater number of Western bishops came, and no more Western bishops would come. Justinian, seeing that by this dodge the Pope was trifling with him, placarded a new edict against the 3 chapters. Vigilius gathered as many bishops as he could in a council and denounced the emperor's usurpation of ecclesiastical authority and excommunicated all who should conform to the edict. Justinian made him a prisoner in Constantinople, but he escaped to Chalcedon and took refuge there at the shrine of St. Euphemia. The emperor did not dare to try to take him from there, and made terms with him. He revoked his edict and deferred the question to a council, at which the Pope promised to be present. But when the council met in 553, the Pope refused to attend unless it was composed of an equal number of bishops of the East and of the West. To this the emperor agreed, but the Eastern bishops unanimously protested. Besides, there was no possibility of having a proper general council composed equally of Eastern and Western bishops, because there were so few Western bishops present. Justinian sent an embassy to the Pope to persuade him of the unreasonableness of his demand, but Vigilius stiffly maintained his ground, insisting on his readiness to meet in council on the terms agreed to by him and the emperor. Justinian at last ordered the council to proceed. Accordingly, 165 Eastern bishops met together, while 16 Western bishops met with Vigilius. The emperor's council condemned the 3 chapters as heretical. The Pope's council approved the 3 chapters by solemn decree acquitting them of all heresy. This decree closes as follows: These things being thus settled by us with all care, diligence, and circumspection, we ordain and decree statutimus et discernimus, that henceforth it shall be lawful for no person in holy orders, however dignified or distinguished, to write, speak, or teach anything touching these 3 chapters, contrary to what we have, by our present constitution, taught and decreed. Nor shall it be lawful for any one, after this our present definition, to move any question about them, But if anything relating to them be said, done, or written contrary to what we have here taught and decreed, we declare it null by the authority of the Apostolic See, in which, by the grace of God, we now preside. The emperor notified the Pope that he must agree with the decree of the Council of the Eastern Bishops, and that if he would not do this, he should be deposed and exiled. The Pope replied that since he could not sign the acts and decrees of such an assembly without renouncing the holy faith of Chalcedon, he was ready to suffer, and suffer with joy, both exile and death in so good a cause. He was therefore immediately seized and sent into exile to Proconnesus, an inhospitable island on the Propontis. The other Western bishops who had composed the Pope's council were also deposed and exiled in different places. After about 5 months in the rocky island of his exile, Vigilius, learning that steps were being taken by the emperor to depose him, and by the people of Rome to elect a new pope, he wrote a letter to the Patriarch of Constantinople, informing him that, upon examining the 3 chapters with more care and attention, he had already examined them with all care and attention, he was fully convinced that they had been deservedly condemned, so he was not ashamed openly to acknowledge and own that he had done wrong to defend them, imitating therein St. Austin, who was not ashamed when he discovered the truth to condemn and retract whatever he had written against it. He concludes thus: "We make it known to the whole Catholic Church that we condemn and anathematize all heresies and heretics, namely Theodore of Mopsuestia and his impious writings, the writings of Theodoret against St. Cyril and the Council of Ephesus, and the letter of Maris the Persian, which is said to have been written by Ibis. We likewise anathematize all who shall presume to defend the said 3 chapters, or shall think them capable of being maintained or defended. We acknowledge for our colleagues and brethren those who have condemned them, and by these presents annul whatever has been done, said, or written by us or by others to defend them." This letter was presented by the Patriarch to the Emperor, but the Emperor would not accept any recantation that did not make it clear that the Pope condemned the 3 chapters as repugnant to the doctrine of Chalcedon. Therefore the Pope made another, February 23, 554, in which he went into the subject in greater detail than at any time before, closing as follows: "We therefore anathematize and condemn the 3 above-mentioned impious chapters, as for what we or others may at any time have said or written in defense of the said 3 impious chapters, we declare the whole, by the authority of this our present Constitution, absolutely null." This document was entirely satisfactory to Justinian, and Vigilius was at once brought back to Constantinople, was received by the emperor with extraordinary marks of honor, and was given liberty to return immediately to Rome. He set out, but on the voyage died early in the year 555. He was succeeded by Pelagius, April 11, 555 to March 1, 560, who had been the close attendant and supporter of Vigilius in all his whole course as pope. Accordingly, he had changed faith exactly as had Vigilius in his many changes, even to the latest one. Therefore Justinian had promised to him the office of pope if he should survive Vigilius. He was with Vigilius when he died, and hastened to Rome to assume the pontificate. But when he arrived there, he found everybody against him, on account of his latest condemnation of the 3 chapters. But having the emperor in his favor, all that was required for him to become pope was a sufficient number of bishops to ordain him. The canons required that there should be at least 3, but in all Italy there could be found but 2 bishops who were willing to take part in the ordination of Pelagius. These 2, with a presbyter of Ostia, performed the ceremony, and so Pelagius became pope. The condition of Justinian's favor to Pelagius was that he should cause the emperor's doctrine as to the 3 chapters to be accepted throughout the West, and now Pelagius must fulfill his part of the bargain. The emperor commanded Narses, his representative in the West, to support Pelagius with all his interest and power. In compliance with the emperor's command, Narses spared no pains to reconcile the people of Rome with their bishop, and succeeded therein so far as to gain over, in a very short time, the greater part of the nobility and clergy. However, Narses used only persuasion to effect his purpose, and this was not swift enough in its results to satisfy Pelagius. He therefore urged Narses to use his imperial authority and compel conformity. Narses demurred, not being willing to persecute. Then the Pope wrote to him as follows: "Be not alarmed at the idle talk of some, crying out against persecution and reproaching the Church as if she delighted in cruelty, when she punishes with wholesome severities or procures the salvation of souls. He alone persecutes who forces to evil, but to restrain men from doing evil, or to punish them because they have done it, is not persecution or cruelty, but love of mankind. Now that schism or separation from the apostolic see is an evil, no man can deny, and that schismatics may and ought to be punished even by the secular power is manifest both from the canons of the Church and the Scripture." He closes his letter with exhorting Narses to cause the heads of the schism to be apprehended and sent under a strong guard to Constantinople, assuring him that he need not scruple to use violence, if it may be so called in the present case, seeing the civil power is allowed, nay, and required by the canons, not only to apprehend, but to send into exile and confine to painful prisons those who, dissenting from their brethren, disturb the tranquility of the Church. Justinian died November 14, A.D. 565. His death restored in some degree the peace of the Church, and the reigns of his 4 successors, Justin II, Tiberius, Maurice, and Phocas, and also the reigns of the 3 successors of Pelagius, John III, July 18, 560 to 573, Benedict, June 3, 574 to July 30, 578, and Pelagius II, November 28, 578 to February 8, 590, are distinguished by a rare though fortunate vacancy in the ecclesiastical history of the East. Yet the confusion over the 3 chapters continued between the Pope and many bishops, and in 588 there began a war between the Pope and the Patriarch of Constantinople over the title of Universal Bishop, which, though not of the same fierce and violent order as had been the war between Justinian and the Pope, was of no less importance in the development of the papacy and the restoration of the Western Empire. In 588 there was held in Constantinople a council to try a certain Gregory, Patriarch of Antioch. This council took advantage of the occasion to bestow upon the Patriarch of Constantinople the title of Universal Bishop. Pelagius, no less disturbed and concerned than if the whole of the Catholic faith had been at stake, or the council had condemned some fundamental article of the Christian religion, immediately declared by the authority and in the name of St. Peter all and every act of that assembly absolutely null, except the sentence in favor of Gregory. He sent letters to Constantinople, to his representative there, and to the Patriarch of Constantinople, in which he charged the Patriarch with pride and ambition, styling his attempt wicked, detestable, and diabolical, and threatening to separate himself from his communion if he did not forthwith relinquish the anti-Christian title he had impiously assumed. Pelagius II died before he could carry the contention any farther, but his place was more than only supplied by his successor, Gregory the Great, September 3, 590 to March 12, 604. Though Gregory never attempted to extend his authority by any new usurpations or encroachments on the rights of his brethren, even of those who were immediately subject to his see, though he never exercised or claimed any new jurisdiction or power, yet he was a most zealous asserter of that which his predecessors had exercised or at any time claimed. He often declared that he had rather lose his life than suffer the see of St. Peter to forfeit any of the privileges it had ever enjoyed, or the prime apostle to be anyways injured or robbed of his rights. It has ever been, even from the earliest times, a maxim of the popes, never to part with any power or jurisdiction which their predecessors had acquired, by what means soever they had acquired it, nor to give up the least privilege which any of their predecessors, right or wrong, ever had claimed. The Bishop of Constantinople was now distinguished all over the East with the pompous title of Ecumenical or Universal Patriarch, and Gregory found that he had so styled himself over and over again in a judgment which he had lately given against a presbyter arraigned of heresy, and of which, at the request of the Pope, he had transmitted to Rome. At this, Gregory took the alarm, and forgetting all other cares, as if the Church, the faith, the Christian religion were in imminent danger, he dispatched in great haste a messenger with letters to Sabinianus, his nuncio at Constantinople, charging him, as he tendered the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, to use his utmost endeavors with the emperor, with the express, and above all, with the bishop himself, his beloved brother, to divert him from evermore using the proud, the profane, the anti-Christian title of universal bishop, which he had assumed in the pride of his heart, to the great debasement of the whole episcopal order. The nuncio, in compliance with his orders, left nothing unattempted which he thought could make any impression on the patriarch, assuring him that unless he relinquished the odious title which had given so great an offense to the Pope, he would find in him a formidable antagonist, not to say an irreconcilable enemy. The patriarch answered that though he was sorry that his most holy brother of Rome should have taken any umbrage at so inoffensive a title, yet since the title had been bestowed by so great a council, not on him alone, but on him and his successors, it was not in his power to resign it, nor would his successors stand to his resignation if he should. The emperor's answer to Gregory was only an exhortation to him to live in peace with the bishop of the imperial city. Gregory replied, "It is very hard that after we have parted with our silver, our gold, our slaves, and even our garments for the public welfare, we should be obliged to part with our faith too, for to agree to that impious title is parting with our faith." Since the patriarch would not yield, Gregory by his nuncio excommunicated him, and then wrote to him a long letter loading the title of universal patriarch or bishop with all the names of reproach and ignominy he could think of, calling it vain, ambitious, profane, impious, execrable, anti-Christian, blasphemous, infernal, diabolical, and applying to him who assume it what was said by the prophet Isaiah of Lucifer, "Whom do you imitate in assuming that blasphemous title? Whom but him who, swelled with pride, exalted himself above so many legions of angels, his equals, that he might be subject to none, and all might be subject to him." The Apostle Peter was the first member of the universal church. As for Paul, Andrew, and John, they were only the heads of particular congregations, but all were members of the church under one head, and none would ever be called universal. And to the empress he wrote, "Though Gregory is guilty of many great sins, for which he well deserves thus to be punished, Peter is himself guilty of no sins, nor ought he to suffer for mine. I therefore, over and over again, beg, entreat, and conjure you by the Almighty not to forsake the steps of your ancestors, but treading in them, to court and secure to yourself the protection and favor of that apostle, who is not to be robbed of the honor that is due to his merit, for the sins of one who has no merit, and who so unworthily serves him. In the month of October A.D. 602, the army of the Danube revolted, declared the Emperor Maurice unworthy to reign, raised to the command a centurion, Phocas, and marched to Constantinople. The capital joined the revolt, and the emperor fled. He with his family hoped to find refuge in the church of St. Euphemia in Chalcedon, but by a tempest were driven ashore and took refuge in the church of St. Autonomus near Chalcedon. In the games that were celebrated in honor of the grand entry of Phocas into the capital, November 23, a dispute for precedence arose between the factions of the circus. When Phocas decided in favor of one faction, the other cried out, "Remember that Maurice is still alive." This aroused all the terrible jealousy of Phocas. The ministers of death were dispatched to Chalcedon. They dragged the emperor from his sanctuary, and the 5 sons of Maurice were successively murdered before the eyes of their agonizing parent. At each stroke which he felt in his heart, he found strength to rehearse a pious ejaculation, "Thou art just, O Lord, and thy judgments are righteous." And such in the last moments was his rigid attachment to truth and justice, that he revealed to the soldiers the pious falsehood of a nurse who presented her own child in the place of a royal infant. The tragic scene was finally closed by the execution of the emperor himself, in the 12th year of his reign and the 63rd of his age. The bodies of the father and his 5 sons were cast into the sea. Their heads were exposed at Constantinople to the insults or pity of the multitude, and it was not till some signs of putrefaction had appeared that Phocas connived at the private burial of these venerable remains. The empress and 3 daughters had been spared at the time of the massacre of the emperor and his sons. However, not long afterward, these were all sent by Phocas to the same place, and were beheaded on the same ground which had been stained with the blood of her husband and 5 sons. After such an example, it would be superfluous to enumerate the names and sufferings of meaner victims. Their condemnation was seldom pressed by the forms of trial, and their punishment was embittered by the refinements of cruelty. A simple and speedy death was a mercy which they could rarely obtain. The hippodrome, the sacred asylum of the pleasures and the liberty of the Romans, was polluted with heads and limbs and mangled bodies, and the companions of Phocas were the most sensible that neither his favor nor their services could protect them from a tyrant, the worthy rival of the Caligulas and Domitians of the first age of the empire. Yet knowing of these things, Pope Gregory the Great lauded Phocas literally to the skies. As soon as Phocas had made himself sole emperor by the massacre of all possible legitimate claimants, he sent to Rome and the other principal cities of the East and West the images of himself and wife. In Rome, the images of the emperor and his wife Leontia were exposed in the Labyrum to the veneration of the clergy and senate of Rome, and afterward deposited in the palace of the Caesars between those of Constantine and Theodosius. And on receiving these images, Pope Gregory the Great wrote to Phocas thus, "Glory be to God in the highest, who, as it is written, changes times and removes kings, who has made known to all what he was pleased to speak by his prophet. The Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he will. Various are the changes, and many the vicissitudes of human life, the Almighty giving sometimes in his justice princes to afflict his people, and sending sometimes in his mercy princes to comfort and relieve them. We have been hitherto most grievously afflicted, but the Almighty has chosen you, and placed you on the imperial throne, to banish by your merciful disposition all our afflictions and sorrows. Let the heavens therefore rejoice. Let the earth leap for joy. Let the whole people return thanks for so happy a change. May the Republic long enjoy these most happy times. May God with His grace direct your heart in every good thought, in every good deed. May the Holy Ghost that dwells in your breast ever guide and assist you, that you may, after a long course of years, pass from an earthly and temporal to an everlasting and heavenly kingdom. Before Phocas received this letter from the Pope, he had sent one to the Pope, saying that at his accession he had found at Constantinople no nuncio of the Pope, and asked that he send one. This gave Gregory another opportunity to laud Phocas, which he did thus: What thanks are we not bound to return to the Almighty, who has at last been pleased to deliver us from the yoke of slavery, and make us again enjoy the blessings of liberty under your empire. That your serenity has found no deacon of the apostolic see residing according to custom in the palace was not owing to any neglect in me, but to the times, the late most unhappy and calamitous times, when the ministers of this church all declined the office that obliged them to reside in the palace, and were even afraid to approach it. But now that they know it has pleased the Almighty in His goodness and mercy to place you on the throne, they fear no more, but exult and rejoice, and courting the office they declined before, fly to your feet with inexpressible joy. We hope the Almighty, who has begun to relieve us, will complete what He has so happily begun, and that He, who has given us such pious lords, will deliver us from our cruel enemies. May the Holy Trinity therefore grant you long life, that the later we have received the blessings that flow from your piety, the longer we may enjoy them. At the same time he wrote also to the new empress as follows: What tongue can utter, what mind can conceive the thanks we owe to God, who has placed you on the throne to ease us of the yoke with which we have been hitherto so cruelly galled? Let the angels give glory to God in heaven. Let men return thanks to God upon earth. For the Republic is relieved, and our sorrows are all banished. May the Almighty, who in His mercy has made you our emperors, make you likewise zealous defenders of the Catholic faith. May He endow your minds with zeal and mercy, with zeal to punish what is committed against God, with mercy to bear and forgive what may be committed against yourselves. May He grant to you and to our most pious Lord a long reign, that the comforts and blessings we enjoy in it may be long. I should perhaps have entreated you to take under your particular protection the hitherto most grievously afflicted church of the Apostle St. Peter. But as I know you love God, I need not ask you to do what I am sure you are ready to do for your own accord. For the more you fear God, the more you must love His apostle, to whom it was said, Thou art Peter, to thee will I give. I do not therefore doubt, but you take care to oblige and bind him to you, by whom you are to be loosened from your sins. May He therefore be the guardian of your empire. May He be your protector on earth. May He be your advocate in heaven, that after a long course of years you may enjoy in the kingdom of heaven the reward that is due to you there, for relieving your subjects from the burdens they groaned under, and rendering them happy upon earth. These praises brought swiftly to the papacy a corresponding reward. The nuncio whom Gregory sent to Constantinople in 603 at the request of Phocas was a certain Boniface, a native of Rome and a deacon of the church in Rome. Gregory the Great died March 12, 604, and was succeeded by Sabinian, September 13, 604 to February 22, 606, who reigned but 1 year, 5 months, and 9 days, and was succeeded by this very nuncio, Boniface, who became Pope Boniface III, February 19 to November 10, 607. Having been sent to Phocas by Gregory under such letters as those which Gregory wrote to Phocas and Leontia, it can be easily understood what would be the attitude and course of Boniface toward the new emperor and empress. And now he was chosen to be pope, expressly because he was one who was not only well known to Phocas, but greatly favored both by him and his wife. For by flattering the usurper, as Gregory had done, and conniving at his cruelties, if not applauding him in them, while the rest of mankind exclaimed against him as an outrageous tyrant, Boniface had so insinuated himself into his good graces as to become one of his chief favorites, or as Sigebert writes, his only favorite, being the only person in the whole city of Constantinople who approved or could so dissemble as to make the tyrant believe that he approved of his conduct. For that merit alone he was chosen to the papal throne. The diligent use which he made of the opportunity that fell to him in the office of nuncio at the court of Phocas can in some measure be comprehended by the fact that, though he was at Constantinople only about a year, and was pope less than 9 months, yet while he was pope he succeeded in securing from Phocas an edict settling upon him and his successors the grand and intensely coveted title of universal bishop. The Patriarch of Constantinople at this time, Cyriacus, had incurred the disfavor of Phocas by protecting the empress, widow of Maurice, and her daughters. And now Boniface had no sooner found himself vested with the papal dignity than, taking advantage of the partiality and favor of Phocas to him, and of his aversion and hatred to the Patriarch Cyriacus, he not only prevailed on the tyrant to revoke the decree settling the title of universal bishop on the bishop of the imperial city, but obtained a new decree settling on himself and his successors that very title. No sooner was the imperial edict vesting him with the title of universal bishop and declaring him head of the church brought to Rome than, assembling a council in the Basilic of St. Peter, consisting of 72 bishops, 34 presbyters, and all the deacons and inferior clergy of the city, he acted there as if he had not been vested with the title alone, though Phocas probably meant to grant him no more, but with all the power of a universal bishop, with all the authority of a supreme head, or rather absolute monarch of the church. For by a decree which he issued in that council, it was pronounced, declared, and defined, that no election of a bishop should thenceforth be deemed lawful and good, unless made by the people and clergy, approved by the prince or lord of the city, and confirmed by the pope, interposing his authority in the following terms: We will and command, Volumus et Jubimus. Thus was the hitherto claimed title and power of universal bishop, or head of the whole church, officially and legally settled upon the Bishop of Rome. And thus, though Boniface III held the papal office so short a time, yet it may truly be said that to him alone the Roman See owes more than to all his predecessors together. That title, as officially and legally bestowed, owed its original to the worst of men. It was procured by the basest of means, by flattering a tyrant in his wickedness and tyranny, and was in itself, if we stand in the judgment of Gregory the Great, anti-Christian, heretical, blasphemous, diabolical. And so in the palace of the Caesars, the place of the image of Phocas between those of Constantine and Theodosius was perfectly fitting, as symbolizing the equality of Phocas with those two in the making of the papacy, and how fitting the workmanship to the workers, the papacy, Constantine, Theodosius, and Phocas. The center of motion in the development of the papacy is next found in Italy, and in a train of circumstances through which the papacy secures independence of the Eastern Empire, and which ends only in the assertion of the supremacy of the papacy over the kingdoms and empires in the restoration of the Western Empire. In AD 568, the Lombards had invaded Italy, and for nearly 20 years wrought such devastation that even the Pope thought the world was coming to an end. The imperial power of the East was so weak that the defense of Italy fell exclusively to the Exarch of Ravenna and the Pope. And as the death of Narses had left his successor, the Exarch of Ravenna, only the dignity of a sovereign which he was too weak to exercise for any useful purpose of government, the Pope alone became the chief defender of Italy. In 594, Gregory the Great concluded a treaty of peace with the Lombards, and the Pope and the King of the Lombards became the real powers in the north and center of Italy. Even at that time, the Pope so far ignored the power of the Eastern Emperor as to send letters to King Childebert and Queen Brunhot under the apparent pretext of recommending a priest whom he sent to the Bishop of Gaul, but in reality to solicit their aid. The wife of the King of the Lombards was a Catholic, and by the influence of Gregory, she solemnly placed the Lombard nation under the patronage of St. John the Baptist. At Monza, she built in his honor the first Lombard church and the royal palace near it. From this, the Lombards soon became Catholic, but though this was so, they would not suffer the priesthood to have any part in the affairs of the kingdom. They never admitted the bishops of Italy to a seat in their legislative councils. And although under the Lombard dominion the Italians enjoyed a milder and more equitable government than any of the other kingdoms which had been founded on the ruins of the empire, this exclusion of the clergy from the affairs of the state was as much against them now, though Catholic, as their Arianism had been against them before, and the popes ever anxiously hoped to have them driven entirely from Italy. In 728, the Edict of the Eastern Emperor abolishing the worship of images was published in Italy. The Pope defended the images, of course, and the Italians swore to live and die in defense of the Pope and the holy images. And thus there was begun a war in which its nature and consequences was in every sense characteristic of the papacy. It established the worship of images as an article of Catholic faith. It developed the supremacy of the Pope in temporal affairs. The first introduction of a symbolic worship was in the veneration of the cross and of relics. And the first introduction of the cross as a visible symbol was by Constantine. It is true that the sign of the cross was used as early as the days of Tertullian, but it was only a sign, made with a motion by the hand upon the forehead or breast. Constantine enlarged upon this by the introduction of the visible cross itself, in the Labyrum. He erected in Rome his own statue, bearing a cross in its right hand, with an inscription which referred the victory of his arms and the deliverance of Rome to that salutary sign, the true symbol of force and courage. The same symbol sanctified the arms of the soldiers of Constantine. The cross glittered on their helmets, was engraved on their shields, was interwoven into their banners, and the consecrated emblems which adorned the person of the emperor himself were distinguished only by richer materials and more exquisite workmanship. But the principal standard which displayed the triumph of the cross was styled the Labyrum. It is described as a long pike intersected by a transversal beam. The silken veil which hung down from the beam was curiously inwrought with images of the reigning monarch and his children. The summit of the pike supported a crown of gold which enclosed the mysterious monogram, at once expressive of the figure of the cross and the initial letters of the name of Christ. The basis of all this was the fiction and the imposture of Constantine's vision of the cross. And from it the Catholic Church, both of the East and of the West, has adopted a prodigy which favors, or seems to favor, the popular worship of the cross. Under Constantine's patronage also, Magnificent churches were erected by the emperor in Rome, adorned with images and pictures, where the bishop sat on a lofty throne, encircled by inferior priests, and performing rites borrowed from the splendid ceremonial of the pagan temple. At first the experiment was made with caution and scruple, and the venerable pictures were discreetly allowed to instruct the ignorant, to awaken the cold, and to gratify the prejudices of the heathen proselytes. By a slow though inevitable progression, the honors of the original were transferred to the copy. The devout Christian prayed before the image of a saint, and the pagan rites of genuflection, luminaries, and incense again stole into the Catholic Church. The scruples of reason or piety were silenced by the strong evidence of visions and miracles, and the pictures which speak and move and bleed must be endowed with a divine energy and may be considered as the proper objects of religious adoration. The use and even the worship of images was firmly established before the end of the 6th century. They were fondly cherished by the warm imagination of the Greeks and Asiatics. The Pantheon and Vatican were adorned with the emblems of a new superstition. The style and sentiments of a Byzantine hymn will declare how far their worship was removed from the grossest idolatry. How can we with mortal eyes contemplate this image, whose celestial splendor the host of heaven presumes not to behold? He who dwells in heaven condescends this day to visit us by his venerable image. He who is seated on the cherubim visits us this day by a picture which the Father has delineated with his immaculate hand, which he has formed in an ineffable manner, in which we sanctify by adoring it with fear and love. Thus stood Catholic idolatry when the Mohammedans, with equal contempt for the images of their worshippers, swarmed up from the deserts of Arabia. And under the influence of the charge of idolatry which the Mohammedans incessantly urged against the Catholics, some began to awake to the thought that perhaps the charge was true. The triumphant Mussulmans who reigned at Damascus and threatened Constantinople cast into the scale of reproach the accumulated weight of truth and victory. The cities of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt had been fortified with the images of Christ, his mother, and his saints, and each city presumed on the hope or promise of miraculous defense. In the rapid conquest of 10 years, the Arabs subdued those cities and these images, and in their opinion, the Lord of hosts pronounced a decisive judgment between the adoration and contempt of these mute and inanimate idols. In this season of distress and dismay, the eloquence of the monks was exercised in the defense of images. But they were now opposed by the murmurs of many simple or rational Christians who appealed to the evidence of texts, of facts, and of the primitive times, and secretly desired the reformation of the Church. Thus began the iconoclastic controversy between the worshippers and the breakers of the images, which continued with bloody and unabated fury for 120 years, 726 to 846, and which finally resulted in the triumph of the worship of images and the religion of Constantine. In A.D. 726, Leo III, the Isaurian, as emperor, ascended the throne of the East. He began in 727 to 730 the famous iconoclastic reform. He ordered the images to be broken to pieces, the walls of the churches to be whitewashed, and prosecuted with honest but imprudent vigor his design of extirpating idolatry. But a fierce dissension at once raged throughout all Christendom. The monks and the people arose in defense of their images and pictures, and the emperor, even in his own capital, was denounced as a heretic and a tyrant. There was an image of the Savior, renowned for its miraculous powers, over the gate of the imperial palace called the Brazen Gate, from the rich tiles of gilt bronze that covered its magnificent vestibule. The emperor ordered the sacred figure to be taken down and broken to pieces. But the people from all parts of the city flew to the defense of their favorite idol, fell upon the officers, and put many of them to death. The women were even more violent than the men. Like furies, they rushed to the spot, and finding one of the soldiers engaged in the unhallowed labor at the top of the ladder, they pulled it down and tore him to pieces as he lay bruised upon the ground. Thus, exclaims the pious annalist, did the minister of the emperor's injustice fall at once from the top of the ladder to the bottom of hell. The women next flew to the great church, and finding the iconoclastic patriarch officiating at the altar, overwhelmed him with a shower of stones and 1,000 opprobrious names. He escaped, bruised and fainting, from the building. The guards were now called out and the female insurrection suppressed, but not until several of the women had perished in the fray. The execution of the imperial edicts was resisted by frequent tumults in Constantinople and the provinces. The person of Leo was endangered, his officers were massacred, and the popular enthusiasm was quelled by the strongest efforts of the civil and military power. When Leo's decree against the worship of images was published in the West, the images of Christ and the Virgin, of the angels, martyrs, and saints were abolished in all the churches in Italy, and the emperor threatened the pope that if he did not comply with the decree, he should be degraded and sent into exile. But the Pope, Gregory II, May 19, 715, to February 20, 732, stood firmly for the worship of images and sent pastoral letters throughout Italy, exhorting the faithful to do the same. At this signal, Ravenna, Venice, and the cities of the Exarchate and Pentapolis adhered to the cause of religious images. Their military force by sea and land consisted, for the most part, of the natives, and the spirit of patriotism and zeal was transfused into the mercenary strangers. The Italians swore to live and die in the defense of the Pope and the holy images. The Greeks were overthrown and massacred. Their leaders suffered an ignominious death, and the popes, however, inclined to mercy, refused to intercede for these guilty victims. At Ravenna, A.D. 729, the riot and bloody strife was so great that even the exarch, the personal representative of the emperor, was slain. To punish this flagitious deed and restore his dominion to Italy, the emperor sent a fleet and army into the Adriatic Gulf. After suffering from the winds and the waves much loss and delay, the Greeks made their descent into the neighborhood of Ravenna. In a hard-fought day, as the two armies alternately yielded and advanced, a phantom was seen, a voice was heard, and Ravenna was victorious by the assurance of victory. The strangers retreated to their ships, but the populous sea-coast poured forth a multitude of boats. The waters of the Po were so deeply infected with blood that during 6 years the public prejudice abstained from the fish of the river, and the institution of an annual feast perpetuated the worship of images and the abhorrence of the Greek tyrant. Amidst the triumph of the Catholic arms, the Roman pontiff convened a synod of 93 bishops against the heresy of the iconoclasts. With their consent, he pronounced a general excommunication against all who by word or deed should attack the traditions of the fathers and the images of the saints. As already stated, Gregory II was now pope. Some of his argument in support of the worship of images is worth setting down here in order that it may be seen how certainly idolatrous is the use of images in the Catholic Church. In 730, Gregory II wrote to the Emperor Leo III thus: 10 years by God's grace you have walked aright and not mentioned the sacred images. But now you assert that they take the place of idols, and that those who reverence them are idolaters, and want them to be entirely set aside and destroyed. You do not fear the judgment of God, and that offense will be given not merely to the faithful, but also to the unbelieving. Christ forbids our offending even the least, and you have offended the whole world, as if you had not also to die and to give an account. You wrote, "We may not, according to the command of God, worship anything made by the hand of man, nor any likeness of that which is in the heaven or in the earth. Only prove to me who has taught us to worship anything made by man's hands, and I will then agree that it is the will of God. But why have not you, O Emperor and head of the Christians, questioned wise men on this subject before disturbing and perplexing poor people? You could have learnt from them concerning what kind of images made with hands God said that. But you have rejected our fathers and doctors, although you gave the assurance by your own subscription that you would follow them. The Holy Fathers and doctors are our scripture, our light, and our salvation, and the 6 synods have taught us that, but you do not receive their testimony. I am forced to write to you without delicacy or learning, as you also are not delicate or learned, but my letter yet contains the divine truth. God gave that command because of the idolaters who had the land of promise in possession and worshipped golden animals, etc., saying, 'These are our gods, and there is no other God.' On account of these diabolical kerapoiota, God has forbidden us to worship them. Moses wished to see the Lord, but he showed himself to him only from behind. To us, on the contrary, the Lord showed himself perfectly, since the Son of God has been made man. From all parts men now came to Jerusalem to see him, and then depicted and represented him to others. In the same way they have depicted and represented James, Stephen, and the martyrs. And men, leaving the worship of the devil, have venerated these images, but not absolutely, with latria, but relatively. Why, then, do we make no representation of God the Father? The divine nature cannot be represented. If we had seen him as we have seen the Son, we could also make an image of him. You say, 'We worship stones and walls and boards.' But it is not so, O Emperor, but they serve us for remembrance and encouragement, lifting our slow spirits upward by those persons whose names the pictures bear, and whose representation they are. And we worship them not as God, as you maintain, God forbid, for we set not our hope on them. And if a picture of the Lord is there, we say, 'Lord Jesus Christ, help and save us.' At a picture of his Holy Mother, we say, 'Holy God-bearer, pray for us with thy Son.' And so with a martyr. It would have been better for you to have been a heretic than a destroyer of images." In this crisis, the papacy formed an alliance with the Lombards, who were glad of the opportunity offered in a zeal for the worship of images to seize upon the Italian territories of the Eastern Emperor. By means of this alliance, entire Italy, excited by the pontiff, resolved to free itself from the rule of the Greek emperors. This alliance, however, did not last long. Each power, the Lombards and the papacy, being determined to possess as much of Italy as possible, there was constant irritation which finally culminated in open hostilities, and the Lombards invaded the papal territory in AD 739. And now what could the Pope do? He could not appeal to his image-breaking enemy, the emperor. The Lombards, though friends of the images, were also now enemies of the Pope. What could be done? Charles Martel, the mayor of the palace of the Frankish kingdom, had gained a worldwide glory by his late victory, 732, over the Mohammedans at Tours. Of all the barbarians, the Franks were the first who had become Catholic, and they had ever since been dutiful sons of the Church. The Pope, now Gregory III, March 18, 732, to November 27, 741, determined to appeal to Charles for help against this assertion of Lombard dominion. He sent to Charles the keys of the sepulchre of St. Peter, some filings from the chains with which Peter had been bound, and more important than all, as the legitimate inheritor of the authority of the ancient Roman Republic, he presumed to bestow upon Charles Martel the title of Roman consul. Throughout these transactions, the Pope appears actually, if not openly, an independent power, leaguing with the allies or the enemies of the empire as might suit the exigencies of the time. And now, the Pope, as an independent potentate,